Welcome to Prism Rounds, where we break down one study at a time.
It's great to be here.
This episode is for education, not medical advice.
That's right. Always consult your local protocols and your clinical team.
And subscribe so you don't miss next week's study. So today we are going somewhere we spent a lot of time thinking about. We're stepping through those double doors of the ICU.
Right past the nurse's station.
Exactly. And we're standing right at the bedside of some of the sickest patients in the hospital. We're going to be looking at the interaction between some really advanced technology and critical care medicine.
Specifically, we're talking about the role of artificial intelligence and, automation in mechanical ventilation.
It's such a massive topic. I mean, when you really think about it, mechanical ventilation is one of the absolute cornerstone interventions of our field.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are just staggering. Over 20 million patients receive it annually worldwide. It saves lives. I mean, that part is undeniable. But it is also, famously, a double-edged sword.
It really is, because while it's keeping you breathing, it can also cause injury. We're always talking about ventilator-induced lung injury.
Diaphragm dysfunction, ventilator-associated pneumonia, the list goes on.
Right. It's this incredibly delicate dance where you need just enough support to keep the patient alive and oxygenated, but not so much that you end up, wrecking the lungs in the process. I always feel like it's trying to inflate a balloon that has all these weak spots.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
If you blow too hard, it pops. But if you don't blow hard enough, it just shrivels up.
Exactly. And, traditionally, that dance is led by a human, an expert. It requires constant expert tweaking. You're at the bedside, you're adjusting the PEEP, you're tweaking the tidal volume, you're staring at the waveforms.
It's so labor-intensive.
Yeah.
And it requires a really high level of expertise. It is absolutely not something you can just set at 9 in the morning and come back to check at 5 in the afternoon.
Not if you want a good outcome now.
Which, of course, brings us right to the central tension of today's deep dive. Can a machine do it better? Can we outsource vent rounds to the ventilator?
Hey. Well, the editorial answer is not set it and forget it yet.
So smart co-pilot, not replacement pilot.
That is probably the best way to frame it right now. And to really explore this whole question, we are digging into a major new study, the ACTiVE trial.
Okay, let's unpack this properly then. What's the mission of this deep dive?
So we are dissecting the ACTiVE trial. The formal title is Effects of Automated Closed-Loop Ventilation versus Conventional Ventilation on Duration and Quality of Ventilation.
And where was this published?
This was in JAMA, just came out online, December 8, 2025. And the mission really is to determine if a specific closed-loop system, which is called IntelliVent SV, gets patients off the ventilator faster.
Faster than what?
Faster than a team of humans who are following a very, very strict protocol.
This really feels like a showdown then. Man versus machine, but in the ICU. This isn't just about breathing tubes. This is the exact same question we're asking about self-driving cars, about AI writing code, or about automated stock trading.
It is. Can an algorithm which never sleeps and can process, 1,000 data points a second, actually outperform a human expert?
And it's in such a high-stakes environment. In the ICU, a mistake doesn't just lose you money, it can cost a life. That question feels incredibly heavy here.
It is, in a way, but it's also about optimization. I think the researchers were looking at whether automation can standardize care and, maybe improve outcomes in what is an incredibly complex environment.
Okay, so we have the stage set. On one side, we have what you've called the ghost in the machine, the IntelliVent ACTiVE system. It's armed with these physics equations and tireless sensors.
And on the other side, we have the gold standard, a team of highly trained Dutch and Swiss clinicians with a strict, protocolized playbook.
So to see who wins, the researchers designed this battlefield. And that's the ACTiVE trial. To understand the results, we first have to understand the rules of engagement. So let's start with the PICO breakdown. Who are we looking at here? Population.
So the population and setting. This was a large multi-center study. It took place in 7 ICUs across the Netherlands and Switzerland.
Okay, so we're dealing with European centers. That usually implies a pretty high standard of care to begin with, right? I mean, these are not resource-poor settings.
That's a really important point, correct. These are well-resourced academic environments. Now, for the timeline, they enrolled patients between October 2020 and June 2025, and then they had a 90-day follow-up.
That's a pretty significant chunk of time. That spans the back end of the pandemic era as well.
It does. And who were the participants? They were adults who were invasively ventilated. But here is probably the most crucial detail about the population.
Yeah.
They were randomized within less than 1 hour of starting ventilation.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, hold on. Less than an hour. That is fast. Usually, these trials wait until the patient stabilizes a bit, until the lines are in, until the family's been updated.
Right.
Less than an hour means the dust hasn't even settled from the intubation procedure itself.
Exactly right. This was an incredibly early intervention. The other main inclusion criterion was an expected need for ventilation of greater than or equal to 24 hours.
So they were trying to capture patients who were sick enough to need at least a day on the vent, but they caught them right at the door, essentially, as they were coming into the ICU.
That's the perfect way to describe it.
Okay, so we have these patients, newly intubated. There's probably still chaos in the room, lines going in. Let's talk about the intervention. You called it the ghost in the machine. What exactly is IntelliVent ACTiVE?
The intervention group received closed-loop IntelliVent ACTiVE.
I want to try and visualize this intervention for a second. Usually when I walk into an ICU room, there's a respiratory therapist or a nurse standing there, tweaking knobs on the ventilator, watching the waveform on the screen. In this intervention group, is that person just gone? Is the machine just humming along by itself?
The person isn't gone, no, but you could say their hands are off the wheel. The machine is the pilot in this scenario. The therapist becomes more like the air traffic controller, just watching the radar.
Okay.
It's an automated mode. Essentially, the ventilator adjusts its own settings in real time based on the feedback it's getting from the patient. It's not just a set pressure or a set volume that you dial in. It's using the Otis equation and Meade formula.
Let's stop and appreciate the Otis equation for a second. That sounds like something from a 1950s physics textbook meeting, 2020's AI.
It essentially is. It's respiratory physics. The Otis equation basically calculates the energy cost of breathing. The best analogy I've heard is to think of it like a car. You can drive 60 miles an hour in second gear. You'll have high RPM, you'll burn a ton of energy, the engine's just screaming. Or you can drive at that same speed in fifth gear with low RPM much more efficiently. This algorithm is constantly shifting gears for the patient's lungs.
So it's trying to find the most fuel-efficient way for the lungs to operate.
Precisely. It calculates the exact combination of respiratory rate and tidal volume that requires the least amount of caloric burn, the least work for the patient to breathe.
So it's trying to preserve the patient's energy for, fighting sepsis or healing an injury, not just for the act of breathing. It's optimizing the fuel economy of the lungs.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. It also auto-adjusts PEEP, that's positive index expiratory pressure, and the FiO2, which is the fraction of inspired oxygen.
How does it do that?
It adjusts them based on SpO2 and end-tidal CO2 targets that the clinician sets.
So let's break that down for someone who isn't an intensivist. Imagine you have two big dials on a dashboard. One is FiO2. That's just the raw percentage of oxygen we're pushing into the lungs. The air we're breathing right now is 21%. These patients might need 40, 60, even 100%.
Right, high-test fuel.
And the other dial is PEEP. I always think of PEEP as a splint that's made of air. It's this little bit of constant pressure that keeps the tiny air sacs, the alveoli, popped open so they don't collapse like sticky balloons every single time you exhale.
That's a perfect analogy. And the machine is playing this constant game of balance. It's thinking, give enough PEEP to keep the lungs open, but not so much that you pop them or, impede blood flow back to the heart.
Right, and give enough oxygen to keep the blood sats up, but not so much that it becomes toxic to the lungs over time.
And it's doing this calculation every single breath. Patient breathes, machine measures, machine adjusts, patient breathes again. It's a constant, relentless cycle of optimization.
That is the challenger, the tireless robot. So who is the defending champion? What was the comparator group doing?
The control group received protocolized conventional ventilation.
Okay, that word protocolized is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, I suspect.
It really is. This wasn't just, do whatever you feel like. This was not usual care. It included standardized sedation and weaning protocols. The clinicians set the parameters, but they were following a very strict playbook.
So we are really comparing a smart machine against humans who are absolutely bringing their A game. This isn't a machine versus a tired intern at 3 in the morning. This is a machine versus a highly structured expert team.
Exactly. And that is a critical distinction we will definitely come back to when we talk about the results.
Okay, so last part of the PEEP ISO. What was the scoreboard? What was the primary outcome they were measuring?
The primary outcome was ventilator-free days, or VFD, at day 28.
We see this outcome a lot in critical care trials. Can you just quickly remind us why VFD is so popular?
Sure. It's a composite outcome. It elegantly captures both survival and the duration of ventilation in a single number. It's defined as the number of days that a patient is alive and free from invasive ventilation.
Hold on, because ventilator-free days sounds like it should be a simple count. I survived 20 days off the vent, you survived 10, so I win. But the math is actually a bit grim, isn't it? Why can't we just average the number of days?
You can't because of the zeros. In the ICU, a score of 0 doesn't just mean you didn't get off the ventilator. It usually means you didn't make it out of the ICU alive.
Right.
There's a really important definition here. If a patient dies before day 28, their VFD count is 0. So to get a high score, you have to do two things. You have
Yeah.
to survive, and you have to get off the vent quickly.
Right. Dead patients don't have ventilator-free days. If I die on day 3, I get 0 VFDs. If I stay on the vent for all 28 days but I survive, I also get 0 VFDs.
Exactly. So a simple average would hide all that tragedy.
Yeah.
VFD is a composite of both mortality and morbidity, which makes it a really powerful endpoint for these kinds of studies.
All right, that's a great setup. Let's move to part 2, the methodology deep dive. We have the 2 teams, we have the scoreboard. How is this study designed to ensure a fair fight?
Well, this was a randomized superiority trial.
Meaning, they were specifically trying to prove the machine was better, not just that it was equal. They were looking for a knockout. They wanted to show the machine could beat the human.
Yes, that was the hypothesis.
Yeah.
And regarding blinding, the clinicians were open label. You really can't hide the ventilator screen from them.
Right.
If the machine is changing the numbers by itself, the nurse and the RT are going to notice. The screen looks different, the alarms behave differently.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to placebo control a robot.
Exactly. But, importantly, the statistician was blinded. And that adds a crucial layer of objectivity to the final analysis. They just saw Group A and Group B and ran the numbers.
Now, you mentioned earlier that they enrolled people within 1 hour of intubation. I want to pause on the logistics of that because that sounds almost impossible.
It's incredibly difficult.
I mean, think about the real-world situation. You have a patient who is crashing. They need a tube down their throat right now. Their family is likely in the waiting room, terrified, or maybe they're not even at the hospital yet. You cannot pause that emergency to hand someone a 20-page legal document and say, "Excuse me, could you please read this and sign here?" It's just impossible.
It is. You generally don't. And that is what they call the consent challenge. To get patients enrolled within that 1 hour window, they used a deferred consent model.
So they enroll the patient, they start the protocol, and then they ask for permission later. It's a save the life first, do the paperwork second approach.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They get consent from a legal representative as soon as it's feasible. However, and this is a big however, the regulations in the participating countries, the Netherlands and Switzerland, required post-randomization exclusions if deferred consent was not eventually obtained.
Oh, that sounds tricky for the data.
It is very tricky. This led to a significant number of withdrawals from the study after randomization. The editorial specifically notes that this is a validity concern in open-label trials
Why?
because you lose data on patients after they've already been assigned to a group, and you don't know why you lost them.
So if I'm in the machine group and 2 days later my family comes in and says, "No, we don't want him in this study," my data just vanishes, even if the machine was working perfectly for those 2 days.
Correct. Or even if the machine was failing miserably. If that happens unevenly between the groups, or if the reason for the withdrawal is somehow linked to the treatment.
Like maybe the family sees the machine doing things on its own and it gets them scared, so they withdraw consent.
Exactly. That could introduce a huge bias. And in this case, about 20% of the entire randomized cohort was withdrawn post-randomization.
20%, that's a huge chunk of missing data. That is 1 in every 5 patients just vanishing from the final analysis.
It is a very high number. The editorial compares it to a trial with 20% loss to follow-up, which in any other context would be a major red flag. But again, their hands were tied by the local regulations. It really just highlights how incredibly difficult it is to do this kind of acute research in the ICU.
Okay, let's talk about how they got people off the vent. The weaning protocols. This is the exit strategy. How did they handle that?
This is where the protocolized part of the control group really shines. Extubation readiness was assessed greater than or equal to 3 times daily in both groups.
30 times a day.
At least 3 times a day. Morning, afternoon, and evening.
That's intense. In a typical ICU, in my experience, do you get screened for extubation 3 times a shift?
In many places, it's once a day, if you're lucky. Maybe once in the morning during rounds with the whole team. And if you miss that window, let's say the patient is a little too sedated at 8 a.m., you often just wait until tomorrow. You lose a whole 24 hours.
But here, in this trial, they checked again at noon. and again in the evening.
Yes. So my reaction to that frequency is that's a very optimized control arm.
It sounds like the control arm wasn't just standard care, it was super care. It was the best possible version of human-led care.
I agree completely. The editorial points out that this level of assessment exceeds usual care in many, if not most, health systems. So they were effectively comparing the machine against a center of excellence standard of care.
It's like racing a new self-driving car against a Formula One driver, not against your average daily commuter. If the machine loses, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad driver. It just means it didn't beat the best of the best on their best day.
That is a very apt analogy. The closed-loop group used automated spontaneous breathing trials, or SBTs, and the control group used conventional SBTs. But the frequency of checking for readiness was identical and very high in both arms.
Okay, before we get to the results, I want to pause for a second. You mentioned ventilator-free days and complicated math involved. Let's do a quick teach the fellow moment here. We talked about how simple averages don't work because of all the zeros from patients who died. So how do you actually crunch the numbers on VFD? What is the statistical magic trick they use?
So as we said, the VFD data is what we call skewed and zero-inflated. Zero-inflated is just a fancy term for what we discussed. A lot of people have a score of 0 because mortality in this population is unfortunately high.
Right.
So to handle that, they use a cumulative logistic model, which is also known as a proportional odds model.
Okay, can you give us the English translation, please? What does proportional odds mean for the listener who might be driving to work right now?
Think of it less about calculating the average number of days and more about calculating the odds of having a better outcome overall. Imagine you took the entire population of patients in the study and lined them up from the worst possible outcome on the left, which is death, all the way to the best possible outcome on the right, which would be getting extubated on day 1.
Okay, I'm visualizing that line of patients.
What the model does is it looks to see if the intervention, in this case the machine, shifts that entire line towards the good end. An odds ratio, or OR, that's greater than 1 would mean there's a shift towards more ventilator-free days.
So if the odds ratio was, say, 1.5, it would mean that for any given point on that line, a patient in the machine group has 1.5 times the odds of being to the right of that point, of having a better outcome, than a patient in the human group. It's like it pushes the whole bell curve to the right.
Exactly. It's looking for a shift in the entire distribution towards better outcomes across the whole range, from death, which is 0 days, all the way up to early extubation, which could be up to 27 VFDs.
So the translation is, because so many people either die, which gives them a score of 0, or get off the vent very quickly, a simple average doesn't work. This special model looks for a wholesale shift in the distribution towards better outcomes.
Precisely. It's a much more robust and clinically meaningful way to handle the all-or-nothing nature of so many critical care outcomes.
All right, I think it's time for the drum roll. Let's get to part 4, the results. What actually happened? Did the ghost in the machine take home the trophy?
Okay, let's look at the numbers. They randomized 1,514 patients, but after those consent withdrawals we talked about, that big 20% chunk, they were left with 1,201 patients in the modified intention to treat, or ITT, analysis. So that's about 79% of the original group.
And who were these people, demographically?
The median age was 63, about 36% were women. It was a fairly representative sample of a general mixed medical surgical ICU population in Europe.
Okay. And the primary outcome findings, did the machine win?
The median ventilator-free days at day 28 was 16.7 for the closed-loop group.
16.7. Okay, and for the human group?
16.3 for the conventional group.
16.7 versus 16.3. That's basically the same number. That's a difference of less than half a day. It's a difference of hours, not days.
It is remarkably close. The odds ratio, that number we were just talking about, was 0.91, and the 95% confidence interval was 0.77 to 1.06.
So the confidence interval crosses 1, which means you can't rule out that there's no effect, or even that it could be slightly harmful or slightly beneficial. And the p-value?
The p-value was 0.23.
So the verdict?
No difference. The machine was not superior to the protocolized humans.
Wow. So all of that fancy algorithmic work, the Otis equation, the Meade formula, those constant breath-by-breath adjustments, and in the end, it was a tie.
It was a tie with highly vigilant humans. That's the key context we have to keep coming back to.
A very important point. What about safety? I mean, a neutral result on efficacy is one thing, but did the machine accidentally hurt anyone? Did it pop any lungs? What did mortality look like?
A critical question. So day 28 mortality was 37.2% in the closed-loop group versus 36.5% in the conventional group. The hazard ratio was 1.04 with a p-value of 0.69.
Basically identical. And what about long-term? Did anything change by day 90?
No. The day 90 mortality was 41.0% versus 40.0%. Again, a hazard ratio of 1.04, p-value of 0.66.
So safe, but not a survival booster.
Exactly. It didn't kill anyone extra, but it didn't save anyone extra either. If you look at the survival curves in the paper, they are practically sitting right on top of each other.
Okay, so that's the big headline, a tie. But usually in these big, expensive trials, there are some interesting nuggets hidden in the secondary outcomes. So let's move to part 5. Secondary outcomes and this idea of ventilation quality.
This is where things get a little more fascinating and also a little more complicated. They looked at something they called ventilation quality.
Okay, what does that even mean? How do you measure the quality of a breath?
They defined specific zones, an optimal zone, an acceptable zone, and a critical zone for key ventilation parameters. Things like tidal volume, driving pressure, and end tidal CO2.
The Goldilocks zone.
Exactly. They were asking how much time did the patient spend in that just right Goldilocks zone where the ventilation is not too much and not too little.
What did they find?
They found signals that favored the closed-loop group, but only in a subset of patients where they could collect this high-frequency data. In that subset, the machine was better at keeping the parameters inside that optimal zone.
You know, that makes intuitive sense to me. A machine doesn't get distracted. It doesn't need to go on a coffee break. It doesn't get called to a code in the next room. It is watching breath by breath.
Right.
A human nurse or RT might set the ventilator perfectly and then walk away for 20 minutes to help another patient. In that time, the patient's lung compliance can change, their sedation can wear off, and they can drift out of that optimal zone. The machine would catch that instantly.
That's the theory. It's about relentless consistency. They also found that some adverse events like severe hypoxemia, severe hypercapnia, and interestingly, the need for rescue therapies like prone positioning occurred less often in the closed-loop group.
Whoa, hold on. Less prone positioning. That sounds clinically significant. Prone positioning, flipping a patient onto their stomach, is a huge undertaking. It takes 5 or 6 staff members, it's risky, lines can get pulled out, pressure sores can develop. If the machine reduced the need for that, isn't that a big deal?
It absolutely sounds like it, but
Huh.
we have to be extremely careful here. And this brings us to our second teach the fellow moment. Interpretation, caution.
So should we get excited about these secondary wins, or is this just a statistical mirage?
I think we need to apply the brakes. The first thing is that when you have many, many secondary outcomes, you increase the risk of chance findings.
Right, the multiple comparisons problem.
Yeah.
If you flip a coin enough times, you'll eventually get 10 heads in a row just by dumb luck.
Exactly. To their credit, the authors used a Holmbound-Ferroni method to adjust for this, which is a statistical penalty for, fishing for answers. But the bigger issue is what you pointed out earlier.
Which was?
The quality data was only from a convenience sample. It was a subset of patients. It wasn't the whole 1201 patient cohort.
So maybe the data collection for quality was only possible on certain types of ventilators, or maybe only in certain ICUs that had the right software.
Exactly. And whenever you analyze a subset, you have to worry about selection bias. We don't know if that subset is representative of the whole group. As the saying goes, subset signals are hypothesis generating. We cannot claim a clinical victory based on this.
So it's an interesting hint that the machine might provide a smoother ride for the patient, but we can't say for sure that it changes the game yet.
Correct. It's a very interesting hint, but it's not proof.
Okay, let's move to part 6, the editorial takeaways and analysis. The big question is, why was it a neutral trial? Why didn't the robot win?
The accompanying editorial, which is beautifully titled The Ghost in the Machine by Sklar and Ferguson, offers several really insightful reasons for why the machine didn't come out on top.
Okay, what's their first major theory?
Their first point is heterogeneity.
Yeah.
The study included very diverse indications for intubation. We had patients with primary respiratory failure, yes, but we also had patients intubated after a cardiac arrest or for neurologic reasons.
And why does that matter? A lung is a lung, isn't it?
Not exactly. A patient who is intubated for a neurologic reason, let's say a massive stroke or a traumatic brain injury, is often ventilated for airway protection or because they have a decreased level of consciousness. Not because their lung mechanics are failing, their lungs might actually be perfectly healthy.
I see where this is going. So the machine is busy optimizing the lung mechanics. It's playing with the Otis equation. It's finding that perfect fuel-efficient breath.
But the patient is stuck on the ventilator because their brain isn't ready to wake up and breathe on its own yet. The automation of lung mechanics doesn't do anything to speed up their brain recovery.
That is such a crucial point. If the rate-limiting step, the bottleneck, is the brain, then the smartest lung ventilator in the world can't fix it. It's like putting a brand new turbo engine in a car that has no wheels. It doesn't matter how fast and efficient the engine is, you aren't going anywhere.
Exactly. The editorial suggests that if you had run this trial only in patients with severe respiratory failure, the ARDS patients with the stiff, angry, difficult to ventilate lungs, the ones where that dance of pressure and volume really matters, the result might have been different. But in a mixed ICU population, that potential signal gets diluted.
That makes a lot of sense. What's the second big reason they offer?
The second reason is the strong control arm. We've touched on this already. The protocolized control with thrice daily weaning checks may have blunted the VFD impact.
It's just really hard to beat a human team that is already performing at an optimal level.
The editorial states this explicitly. They say the control group in this trial represents a form of optimized, expert-delivered conventional ventilation.
So if you were to run this same study in a more chaotic, understaffed ICU, where the respiratory therapist is covering 20 patients and weaning assessments only happen once a day, if you're lucky,
The machine might have crushed it. If the human standard of care is lower, the machine's relentless consistency becomes a huge advantage. But in this particular trial, the humans were on point. They were checking for extubation readiness constantly, which may have closed the gap that the technology was designed to exploit.
then what about those validity concerns we mentioned earlier with the consent?
The editorial definitely reiterates the deferred consent issue. They state that 20% withdrawals after randomization is a high number, and it threatens the validity of the trial, even if the withdrawals were balanced between the two groups. It's a fundamental validity concern in open-label trials.
Right, because we just don't know who those 20% of people were. Were they the sickest patients, the healthiest? Did they withdraw because the family thought the machine was alarming all the time? We just have no idea.
Exactly. We have to assume it's random, but we can't verify that. That big black hole in the data just makes it hard to be 100% certain about the final result.
So given all that, what's the final conclusion on automation from the editorialists? Is the dream dead? Should we just throw all these algorithms in the trash?
Not at all. The conclusion isn't that automation failed. It's that it's not full autopilot.
Right, it's not a self-driving car that you can get in and take a nap in the back seat.
No. The real question this trial raises for the future is, which specific patients benefit the most? Is it the severe ARDS population? And how do we supervise it? It really shifts the role of the clinician from being a hands-on pilot to being that mission controller, supervising the automation.
All right, let's bring us all home. Part 7, bedside implications. Let's talk directly to the listener now.
Sure.
If you are standing in your ICU tomorrow, you're staring at a ventilator, what does this ACTiVE trial mean for you and your patient?
Well, I think the first big takeaway is this. If you already work in a system with tight protocols and very frequent weaning checks, then adding a closed-loop system may not improve your ventilator-free days.
So if you're already working in a high-performing unit, buying these expensive automated modules might not change your mortality or your length of stay. You might already be at the ceiling of performance.
Based on this data, that's correct. However, the editorial makes the important counterpoint. If your unit doesn't have the resources for thrice daily expert assessments, and many don't, the result might be very different. Though, crucially, that specific scenario wasn't tested here.
That's the resource constraint argument. Maybe this technology isn't for the well-staffed academic center, but it's the great equalizer for understaffed community hospitals.
That's the hypothesis. But we would need a study specifically in that setting to prove it. You can't just extrapolate from this trial.
What about the other things we care about? Workload or cost? Did it save time? Did the nurses and RTs get to drink more coffee or spend more time with the patient's family?
It was not reported. We cannot claim that it reduces nurse or RT workload based on the text of this study.
That really feels like a missed opportunity. Because if the machine yields the exact same clinical result, but it saves the staff, say, 2 hours of fiddling with knobs per day.
That would be a huge win. In today's burnout-ridden healthcare system, efficiency is a clinical outcome in itself. But this study didn't measure that, so we can't make that claim.
And one last question, the one everyone always wants to know about. Does it help specifically in ARDS? You know, acute respiratory distress syndrome, that's the big bad wolf of mechanical ventilation.
It was not established by this trial. The rates of ARDS in this study were actually very low, around 2% of the population.
2%, that's tiny.
It is. This was a general ICU population, not an ARDS-focused trial. So we absolutely cannot generalize these findings to that specific, very sick subgroup. If you have a patient with severe ARDS in front of you, you can't look at this study and say, the machine will fix it. We just don't have the data from this trial to support that.
Okay, let's wrap this up. We've covered the PICO, the stats, the very neutral primary result, and all the important editorial caveats.
It was a dense but really important study.
If you found this helpful, share with a colleague and subscribe so you don't miss next week's study.
And remember, this is not medical advice.
So, summarizing the final vibe here, the technology is advancing, the ghost in the machine is definitely getting smarter, but it hasn't replaced the fundamental need for human protocol, human oversight, and human clinical judgment.
It's a tool, a potentially powerful one, but it's not a replacement for the clinician.
Smart vent still needs a grown-up.
Precisely.
And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over. The editorial briefly mentions the concept of non-inferiority.
Right.
This was a superiority trial. It was designed to win, and it failed to win. It was a tie. But what if the machine achieving the same results as a highly trained, protocol-driven team of humans is actually a victory for the machine?
That's a really interesting way to reframe the entire question.
If it frees up human cognition for other tasks, does no difference in ventilator-free days actually mean a huge difference in overall ICU capacity and quality of care? If the machine can handle the knobs, can the human now spend more time handling the family meeting, figuring out the complex shock, or just chasing down that difficult differential diagnosis?
It's the difference between better outcomes and better efficiency. If the outcome is the same, but the human clinician is freed up to do the things that only a human can do, maybe that is the win we should be looking for.
Exactly. The machine handles the physics, the human handles the humanity. It's something to watch for in the future. Thanks for diving in with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.